I stood outside the ballroom entrance, letting the crisp evening air settle my thoughts. The sting of public humiliation still lingered, but my mind wasn't focused on the insults. My attention was fixed on something far more important. 3 weeks earlier, my entire world had changed because I arrived at my daughter's Emily's house just a few minutes ahead of schedule. If I had shown up on time instead of early, I might have spent the rest of my life believing her husband was the respectable attorney everyone admired. Instead, I overheard a conversation that exposed the truth hiding beneath his polished smile. From that moment on, I knew I wasn't dealing with a loyal husband. I was dealing with a patient, calculating man who intended to strip my daughter of everything she had worked for before quietly walking away with another woman. It all started on an overcast Tuesday afternoon when Emily called and asked if I could wait at her house for a plumber while she flew to Denver for an emergency business meeting. Since retiring, helping my daughter had become the most meaningful part of my life, so I agreed without hesitation. She had given me a spare key years earlier for emergencies, and I let myself inside about 10 minutes before I was expected. I had barely stepped through the front door when unfamiliar laughter drifted from the living room. It wasn't a television, it wasn't a phone call. It was a woman's voice, mixed with the unmistakable voice of my son-in-law, Ethan. At that hour, Ethan was supposed to be at his downtown law office. Decades of serving in military intelligence taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had told me something was terribly wrong. Without making a sound, I slipped into the study beside the hallway. From the narrow opening of the partially closed door, I could clearly see the living room. Ethan had his arms wrapped around a young brunette wearing a fitted crimson dress. It certainly wasn't my daughter. I stayed perfectly still as they laughed together like two people with nothing to fear. Then Ethan kissed her forehead and told her he couldn't wait until they no longer had to hide their relationship. Her name was Lauren, an employee at one of the firms his company regularly worked with. She teased him by asking whether Emily suspected anything. Ethan chuckled without the slightest trace of guilt. He said Emily wasn't a wife anymore. She was simply an obstacle standing between him and the future he deserved. He explained that once his upcoming promotion became official, he would file for divorce after quietly moving as much of their shared money as possible beyond her reach. He even bragged that by carefully planning everything in advance, Emily would leave the marriage with almost nothing, while he walked away with the house, the investments, and his spotless reputation. Every word felt like another blow to my chest. My fists tightened until my nails dug into my palms, but years of discipline kept me rooted in place. Storming into the room would have satisfied my anger for a few seconds, yet it would have accomplished nothing. Ethan would erase every trace of what he had done, and Emily would be left fighting a battle she couldn't win. So I remained silent, watching until the two of them disappeared upstairs. Only after I heard the bedroom door close did I quietly leave the house. I sat alone inside my pickup truck for nearly 2 hours, staring through the windshield while replaying every sentence I had heard. Eventually, I stopped asking myself how I had failed to recognize the man Ethan truly was. Regret wouldn't protect my daughter. Action would. On the drive home, I called someone I hadn't spoken to in years. His name was Jack Morrison, a former teammate from my intelligence days who would become one of the most respected private investigators in the state. I explained only the essentials. I needed surveillance equipment, financial research, and complete discretion. Jack paused for a moment before asking if the situation was serious. I looked back toward Emily's neighborhood through the rearview mirror and answered in a calm voice that someone had crossed the one line no father should ever have to defend. By the time I ended the call, the first stage of my plan was already taking shape. Ethan believed retirement had turned me into an old man who spent his afternoons watching television and watering flowers. What he didn't know was that 40 years of intelligence work had taught me how to uncover the truth without anyone realizing they were being investigated. Jack and I met the following afternoon at a quiet roadside diner hidden behind an aging warehouse district, the kind of place where conversations stayed between the people sitting at the table. He arrived carrying a thick manila envelope and slid it toward me without saying a word. His expression alone told me the news wasn't going to be good. After a long silence, he finally spoke. "Frank, brace yourself. Your son-in-law isn't just dishonest. He's been preparing this for a long time." I opened the file and immediately recognized the pattern. Years spent studying classified reports had trained my eyes to find connections ordinary people overlooked. Ethan had quietly created a shell company called Summit Advisory Group more than a year earlier. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary business consulting, but the financial records painted a very different picture. Instead of investing his own money, he had secretly transferred nearly $30,000 from the joint savings account he shared with Emily. Rather than taking large withdrawals that might raise suspicion, he moved small amounts every few days, usually between $300 and $1,000. The transactions blended into everyday household expenses, making them almost impossible to notice. Emily traveled constantly for work and trusted him completely, so she never questioned the missing funds.
Jack continued laying photographs and bank statements across the table. The money Ethan stole wasn't sitting untouched in a savings account. He had used it to lease an upscale apartment where Lauren lived, paid for expensive vacations, luxury dinners, jewelry, even furniture for the life they planned to begin together after divorcing my daughter. Every dollar represented another sacrifice Emily had made while believing she was building a secure future with the man she loved. Looking at those documents made my stomach tighten. That account wasn't just money. It represented years of overtime, business trips, birthdays spent apart, and dreams she believed they shared. Ethan had stolen far more than cash. He had stolen her trust. Then Jack handed me another folder containing copies of Ethan's internet search history recovered from his personal computer. As I read through the pages, I realized the betrayal went even deeper. For months, he had researched divorce strategies, asset protection methods, and legal loopholes designed to reduce spousal support. He wasn't simply planning to leave Emily. He was building a detailed legal strategy to convince a judge that she was financially irresponsible and emotionally unstable. He had even drafted notes describing how to portray her demanding work schedule as evidence that she neglected the marriage. Everything had been carefully organized long before Emily suspected anything was wrong. I leaned back in the booth and slowly closed the folder. Ethan hadn't acted impulsively. Every lie, every fake smile, every anniversary celebration, and every promise had been part of a long-term plan. He intended to secure his promotion, transfer the remaining assets, divorce Emily, and begin a new life with Lauren while leaving my daughter devastated both emotionally and financially. It wasn't simply adultery anymore. It was calculated deception. Jack asked what I wanted him to do next. I answered without hesitation. I wanted complete copies of every email, every text message, every bank transfer, every receipt, and every photograph connecting Ethan and Lauren. Nothing was too small. I also wanted everything backed up in multiple secure locations. Exposing an affair wouldn't be enough. Ethan was an attorney whose career depended on credibility and professional ethics. If I intended to protect my daughter, I needed evidence so overwhelming that no excuse or carefully crafted argument could save him. That evening, I spread every document across my dining room table and spent hours organizing the timeline. Patterns became obvious almost immediately. Whenever Emily left town for business, money disappeared from the joint account within 24 hours. Every expensive gift Lauren received matched a suspicious reimbursement filed through Ethan's consultant company. Hotel reservations, restaurant receipts, rideshare records, and expense reports fit together like pieces of the same puzzle. The deeper I dug, the clearer everything became. Ethan believed he had hidden every trail. He forgot the oldest lesson I had learned during my years in intelligence. Every decision leaves evidence. The only question is whether someone has the patience to find it. As midnight approached, an unexpected calm settled over me. My anger had transformed into determination. This was no longer about revenge. It was about ensuring my daughter never became another victim of a man who mistook kindness for weakness. Before leaving, Jack reminded me that Ethan's promotion celebration would take place the following week at Emily's own home. Senior partners, judges, clients, and influential business leaders would all be attending. I looked at the invitation lying beside the evidence and quietly smiled. Ethan believed that evening would mark the greatest achievement of his career. He had no idea it would become the beginning of its collapse.
During the week leading up to the celebration, I stayed completely out of Ethan's sight. Men like him become careless when they believe they've already won. Every morning, Jack sent me another secure package containing fresh evidence. Phone records confirmed hundreds of calls between Ethan and Lauren during hours when Emily believed her husband was working late. Credit card statements revealed expensive dinners that had been disguised as business meetings. Security footage from the luxury apartment showed Ethan entering the building so often that the concierge greeted him like a permanent resident. Piece by piece, the polished image he had built for years was falling apart. By the time the week ended, I wasn't holding a suspicion anymore. I was holding proof strong enough to dismantle every lie he had ever told. I finally decided it was time to tell Emily part of the truth. I invited her to dinner at my apartment under the excuse of catching up before her busy schedule became even more demanding. She looked exhausted when she arrived. Dark circles rested beneath her eyes, and although she smiled, I could tell she had been carrying burdens she hadn't shared with anyone. Over dinner, she admitted Ethan had become distant over the past several months. He blamed stress from work, spent more evenings away from home, and rarely showed any interest in spending time together anymore. She wondered if she had somehow failed him. Hearing those words broke my heart, because I knew she was blaming herself for a betrayal she had never caused. I reached across the table and gently held her hand. "Emily," I said quietly, "if someone chooses dishonesty, that choice belongs to them, not the person who trusted them." She looked at me with confused eyes, sensing that I knew more than I was saying. She asked whether something was wrong, but I wasn't ready to reveal everything. The evidence wasn't complete yet, and I refused to expose Ethan until there was absolutely no path left for him to escape responsibility. I simply told her to stay patient, avoid signing any financial paperwork, and let me handle a situation I was already working on. She trusted me without asking another question, and that trust only strengthened my resolve. The night before the promotion party, Jack delivered the final package. Inside were encrypted copies of Ethan's financial records, photographs of him and Lauren together, emails discussing their future after the divorce, and documents proving that he had intentionally moved marital assets into hidden accounts. There was even a handwritten checklist outlining each step of his divorce strategy. Reading it felt like looking into the mind of a man who viewed marriage as nothing more than a business transaction. At the bottom of one page, he had written a sentence that stayed with me for hours. "Once the promotion is official, she'll have no leverage left." He truly believed my daughter was already defeated. I locked every document inside the concealed safe beneath the floorboards of my study before going to bed. Sleep never came. Instead, I spent the night reviewing every detail of the plan one final time. Years earlier, during intelligence operations, I learned that successful missions weren't won through emotion, they were won through preparation. Tomorrow would be no different. Ethan expected applause, congratulations, and admiration from the most influential people in the city. Instead, he was about to experience the first crack in the perfect image he had spent years creating. The evening of the celebration arrived, and Emily's beautiful home had been transformed into an elegant reception. Crystal chandeliers reflected warm light across polished marble floors, while servers moved gracefully through the crowd carrying trays of expensive food and champagne. Executives, attorneys, judges, and longtime clients congratulated Ethan as though he had already become one of the most respected young lawyers in the state. He wore an expensive tailored suit and greeted every guest with complete confidence. Looking at him from across the room, no one would have guessed that his entire future was hanging by a thread. Emily stood beside him, welcoming guests with a polite smile, but I could see the fatigue hidden behind her eyes. Ethan barely acknowledged her unless someone happened to be watching. Whenever another influential guest approached, he immediately shifted the attention back to himself, proudly talking about his promotion and the promising future waiting for him. I remained near the back of the ballroom with a glass of water in my hand, quietly observing everything. Predators often reveal the most about themselves when they believe they are completely safe. Tonight, Ethan was more confident than I had ever seen him. As the evening reached its peak, Ethan raised his glass and asked everyone for a moment of attention. He thanked his partners for believing in him and spoke about ambition, sacrifice, and success. Then his eyes settled on me. A slow smile crossed his face as he decided to entertain the crowd at my expense. He smiled at the audience before gesturing toward me as though he were about to pay me a compliment. "I'd also like to thank my father-in-law," he announced. "He's always reminded me that a simple life is enough. Not everyone has the drive to chase real success, but he taught me to appreciate modest expectations." Laughter rippled through the room. A few guests smiled politely while others exchanged uncomfortable glances. Emily lowered her eyes, clearly embarrassed, but Ethan mistook her silence for acceptance. His promotion had inflated his ego so much that he no longer recognized the difference between confidence and arrogance. A few moments later, one of the servers approached carrying a tray filled with chocolate pastries. They happened to be my favorite dessert, something Ethan knew because Emily had mentioned it countless times over the years. As the waiter stepped beside us, Ethan deliberately brushed against the tray with his elbow. The plate slipped from the server's hands and crashed onto the marble floor. Chocolate cream splattered across my shoes and trouser legs, while broken pieces scattered around my feet. The room fell silent. Instead of apologizing, Ethan threw back his head and laughed. "Looks like your reflexes aren't what they used to be," he said loudly enough for nearly everyone to hear. Then he looked down at the dessert lying across the floor and added with a smirk, "If you still want one that badly, you can always pick it up yourself. I wouldn't want my celebration spoiled by unnecessary mess." Several guests looked visibly uncomfortable. Even the waiters seemed frozen with embarrassment, but Ethan never noticed. He was too consumed by his own performance. I calmly reached into my pocket, unfolded a handkerchief, and wiped the chocolate from my jacket without saying a word. My silence unsettled him far more than anger ever could have. As I slowly stepped closer, the conversation throughout the ballroom faded away. Everyone seemed to sense that something unexpected was about to happen. When I stopped in front of him, I looked directly into his eyes. Years of military service had taught me that real strength doesn't come from raising your voice. It comes from remaining completely in control while everyone else loses theirs. I gently straightened the front of his suit jacket as though I were helping him prepare for a photograph. The gesture confused him. His smile weakened. Then I leaned close enough that only he could hear my voice. "I know everything." His confidence disappeared from his face instantly. He blinked several times before whispering, "What are you talking about?" Without changing my expression, I quietly continued, "I know about Summit Advisory Group. I know where the missing money went. I know about Lauren, and I even know about the documents hidden inside your office safe." For a split second, all the color drained from his face. His breathing became uneven. Tiny beads of sweat appeared across his forehead. He instinctively reached toward my arm as though he wanted to stop me from speaking any further, but I calmly stepped back before he could touch me. To everyone watching, it looked nothing more than a brief private conversation between family members. To Ethan, it felt like the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. He realized someone had uncovered every secret he believed was safely buried. I finally turned toward the guests and smiled politely. "I apologize for interrupting such a wonderful evening," I said in a calm, respectful voice, "but I believe my son-in-law has several personal and professional matters that deserve his full attention very soon." Nobody laughed this time. The partners who had been congratulating Ethan only minutes earlier now stared at him with quiet curiosity. They noticed his trembling hands, his pale face, and the fear he couldn't hide no matter how hard he tried. I walked over to Emily, gently took her hand, and led her toward the front entrance. As we passed Ethan, I stopped beside him one final time. In a voice only he could hear, I said, "Tonight was only the warning. Tomorrow the real consequences begin." Then I continued walking. When we reached the car, Emily remained silent for several minutes before finally asking, "Dad, what just happened?" I looked at my daughter and squeezed her hand reassuringly. "You don't need to be afraid anymore," I told her softly. "Everything he planned to take from you, we're going to get back." I glanced once through the windshield toward the brightly lit mansion. Inside, Ethan was still standing exactly where I had left him, surrounded by whispers instead of applause. The celebration he had waited years to enjoy had become the longest night of his life. The next morning, I asked Emily to meet me at a quiet cafe on the edge of town, far from the downtown offices where rumors traveled faster than the truth. She arrived looking exhausted, her eyes swollen from a sleepless night, yet there was something different about her. The uncertainty I'd seen for months had begun to disappear. She sat across from me, wrapped both hands around a cup of coffee, and looked straight into my eyes. "Dad," she said softly, "tell me the truth. What do you know?" Without answering immediately, I placed a thick folder on the table between us. "This," I said, "contains everything." Emily slowly opened it. The first pages contained bank records showing thousands of dollars quietly disappearing from their joint savings account. Next came photographs of Ethan and Lauren together outside the luxury apartment. Then there were copies of emails discussing their future after the divorce, followed by documents outlining Ethan's plan to move assets before ending the marriage. Finally, she reached the handwritten notes where he had carefully listed every step he intended to take to leave her financially devastated. Her hands began to shake. For several minutes she couldn't speak. She simply kept turning pages while tears silently rolled down her face. Every new document erased another illusion she had been holding on to. Finally, she closed the folder. "I kept blaming myself," she whispered. "I thought maybe I wasn't enough." I reached across the table and gently held her hand. "No, you loved someone who never deserved your trust. That's not weakness, that's kindness. The shame belongs entirely to him." Emily wiped away her tears and took a slow breath. When she looked back at me, I saw something replacing the heartbreak: determination. "What do we do now?" she asked. I smiled for the first time in weeks. "Now," I said, "we let the evidence speak." At that exact moment, her phone began ringing. The screen displayed Ethan's name. He was calling again. I nodded for her to answer and switched the phone to speaker. The confidence that had filled his voice at the party had completely disappeared. "Emily, please don't overreact. Whatever your father told you isn't the full story. The money wasn't stolen. I was investing it for our future. Everything has a reasonable explanation." Emily remained silent. He continued talking faster. "I know your father's upset about last night, but he's misunderstood everything. Let's sit down together and work this out before people make assumptions." I calmly reached across the table. Emily handed me the phone. "Ethan?" The line instantly went quiet. After several seconds, he finally answered, "Frank, you've spent years preparing for the future. Now it's time to face the present." Another long silence followed. Then I continued. 10 o'clock this morning. Your office. Emily, her divorce attorney, and I will be there." Before he could respond, I ended the call. Exactly at 10 o'clock, we walked into the law firm where Ethan had proudly built his career. Awards covered the walls. Framed certificates lined the hallway. Employees greeted us politely, but I noticed a few of them exchanging curious glances after hearing whispers about the previous night's strange incident. Ethan was already waiting inside the conference room. He looked as though he hadn't slept at all. Dark circles surrounded his eyes, and the confidence that usually filled the room whenever he entered had completely disappeared. Emily quietly took her seat across from him. Beside her sat one of the most experienced divorce attorneys in the state. Without saying a word, Emily placed a copy of their prenuptial agreement on the conference table. Ethan forced a nervous smile. "You know this agreement protects me," he said. "If we divorce, you walk away with almost nothing." Emily opened the document. Then she pointed to one specific clause. "You wrote this yourself," she said. His expression changed. The clause clearly stated that if either spouse intentionally concealed marital assets, committed financial fraud, or engaged in serious professional misconduct that damaged the other spouse's financial interests, the offending party would immediately lose the protections provided by the agreement and become responsible for repaying twice the amount taken. Ethan stared at the page. He had forgotten his own words. Years earlier, he had insisted on adding that clause to protect himself. Now it had become his strongest evidence against him. I slowly placed another folder on the table.
Inside was the completed ethics complaint prepared for the State Bar Association, supported by financial records, emails, photographs, witness statements, and documentation of every hidden transaction. I looked directly at Ethan. "You have one opportunity." I pushed the settlement agreement toward him. "Return every dollar, transfer the house exactly as the settlement requires, sign the divorce papers today." I paused before speaking one final sentence. "If you refuse, this complaint will be filed before the end of the day." The room became perfectly silent. Ethan looked around the conference room, searching for someone willing to stand beside him. He found no one. For several long seconds, nobody moved. Ethan's eyes drifted from the settlement agreement to the ethics complaint and then back to Emily. The confidence that had once made him believe he controlled every situation had completely vanished. His attorney quietly cleared his throat, leaned closer, and whispered something into his ear. Whatever he said erased the last trace of resistance from Ethan's face. His shoulders slowly slumped. He understood exactly what was in front of him. If the complaint reached the state bar, the financial fraud, hidden assets, misuse of company reimbursements, and deceptive conduct during the marriage would become a formal investigation. Even if he somehow avoided criminal consequences, his professional reputation would never recover. Everything he had spent years building could disappear within months. His trembling hand reached for the pen. Without saying another word, he signed the divorce settlement. Next came the property transfer, then the financial reimbursement agreement requiring him to return every dollar he had secretly taken from their joint accounts, along with the additional compensation required under the prenuptial agreement he had written himself years earlier. Each signature felt heavier than the one before. The room remained completely silent until the final page was finished. Emily calmly gathered the documents and handed them to her attorney. "It's over," she said. There was no anger in her voice, no satisfaction, only peace. As we stood to leave, Ethan suddenly pushed back his chair. "You think you've won?" he shouted, his voice breaking with frustration. "You've ruined everything I've worked for." I slowly turned toward him. "No, Ethan," my voice remained steady. "I didn't ruin your future. You spent years building this outcome yourself. I simply refused to let my daughter become the one who paid for it." He stared at me without speaking. For the first time since I'd known him, he had absolutely nothing to say. I looked at him one last time before walking toward the door. The greatest revenge isn't hatred, it's justice. Then Emily and I walked away without looking back. Outside the office building, the morning sun reflected across the parking lot. Emily stopped beside my truck and took a long, deep breath, as though she had finally been able to release the weight she had carried for years. "I don't know how I'll ever thank you," she whispered. I smiled. "You don't owe me anything. I'm your father. I've been protecting you since the day you were born, and I'll never stop." Over the following months, everything Ethan believed was permanent disappeared one piece at a time. He was forced to repay every dollar taken from the marital accounts. His promotion was immediately withdrawn after the firm's partners learned the full truth behind his financial misconduct. Several major clients quietly requested new legal representation, unwilling to associate themselves with someone whose integrity had become the subject of professional scrutiny. Lauren disappeared from his life as quickly as she had entered it. Once the money and prestige vanished, so did she. Emily chose a completely different path. Rather than allowing bitterness to define her future, she used part of the settlement to establish a non-profit organization that helped spouses who had become victims of financial manipulation during marriage. She wanted other families to have the guidance she wished she had had when everything first began. Watching her rebuild her life reminded me that true strength isn't measured by avoiding hardship. It's measured by refusing to let hardship define who you become. About 6 months later, I met Emily for lunch in a neighborhood park. Sitting beside her was Daniel,
a thoughtful architect she had recently started seeing. He wasn't loud or arrogant. He didn't feel the need to impress anyone. What stood out wasn't his career or his appearance. It was the quiet respect with which he treated my daughter. He listened when she spoke. He encouraged her work. Most importantly, he made her smile again. As I watched them together, I realized something important. My mission had never been to destroy Ethan. My mission had always been to protect Emily. Everything else had simply been the natural consequence of Ethan's own choices. People have asked me many times why I never responded with violence after discovering what he had done. The answer has always been simple. Violence may satisfy anger for a moment. Patience creates justice that lasts. During my years in military intelligence, I learned that the strongest victories aren't achieved through rage. They're earned through discipline, preparation, and knowing exactly when to act. Today, I sleep peacefully, not because I defeated someone, but because my daughter reclaimed the future that someone else tried to steal from her. If this story kept you hooked, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable family revenge story. Thank you for watching, and remember, sometimes patience is the strongest form of justice. See you in the next story.